Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. I never imagined life could turn upside down like this, almost as if the ground beneath me disappeared without warning. When I look back, it seems like everything happened quietly, without making much of a fuss, and before I knew it, I was already in the middle of something I couldn't quite explain. I mean, I do know how it all started, but you know when you just don't want to admit it was your fault all along? I guess that's what happened. Hi. I'm Claire and I'll tell you my story, everything began on my husband Mark's birthday. We'd been together for almost 7 years, living our simple life in a small apartment in a quieter part of town. He worked 6 days a week at a mechanic shop, and I, since I left the clothing store where I used to work, had been doing odd jobs selling cosmetics to help with the bills. It wasn't that we were unhappy, far from it. But our marriage wasn't exactly the kind you see in the movies. We were used to each other. And that was that. The passion we had when we first started dating had somehow gotten lost along the way, but life goes on, right? You can't live in a fairy tale forever. Or at least that's what I used to think, on the day of the party, the house was packed, it was scorching hot, and there I was, in the kitchen, finishing up the frying of the pastries I always make when we have people over. The noise of conversations mixed with the sound of the football game playing on TV. It was late in the afternoon, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits, especially Mark, who loved getting friends and family together. It was his birthday, after all, You okay there, Claire? My sister-in-law Carla's voice pulled me out of my thoughts, Yeah, I'm fine, just finishing up the last batch of pastries, I replied, She gave me that crooked smile of hers, the one she always gave when she wanted to stir things up. You look tired. Everything all right with Mark? I rolled my eyes and shrugged. Everything's fine, Carla. I'm just tired of this heat. Can't I even complain? She laughed, but before she could reply, the sound of the front door opening caught our attention. I glanced over to the living room entrance, and there he was, Uncle George. Tall, with that air of confidence about him. His hair was fully grey, but his beard was always neatly trimmed. He was Mark's father's older brother, and even though he was almost 20 years older than us, he was the kind of man who always made an impression when he walked into a room. Not that I'd ever really noticed it before, at least not in this way, What's up, family? He boomed in his deep, enthusiastic voice, walking into the room with a broad smile. I'm here to turn up the heat at this party, Mark was the first to get up from the couch and go over to him, giving him a playful hug, like he always did, Uncle George, I thought you weren't coming. You know it's not the same without you, Mark joked, his usual playful self, thought I wasn't coming? I just had some things to take care of first, but I'm here now, right? George replied, I watched from a distance, the dishcloth in my hand, my hair messily tied up because of the heat. I'd bumped into George plenty of times over the years. He always showed up at family gatherings, but that day, something about him caught my attention in a different way. Maybe it was the way he laughed, so confidently, or the way his eyes seemed to linger on mine a second longer than usual. Of course, it was my fault, I was the one seeing things that weren't there, After he greeted everyone, I brought the tray of pastries into the living room, trying not to feel bothered by his presence, but at the same time, feeling something strange in the pit of my stomach. Silly, right? We end up imagining things for no reason. Claire, these pastries are the best, you know that? George said, grabbing one. Come on, Uncle, grab one, they're better than anything you'll get around here, Mark teased, George took a bite, his eyes meeting mine as if testing something. Honestly, Claire, these are amazing. You should open a shop just for your pastries, I smiled awkwardly. Oh, please, I just make them every now and then, I'm not that good, modest, too. Mark's a lucky guy, George added, his words carried a weight that made me quickly avert my gaze, but that comment lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening. I tried not to think too much about it because, after all, he was my husband's uncle. What kind of woman has inappropriate thoughts about her own husband's uncle? It wasn't right, or maybe it was just all in my head. I didn't know, the evening went on, with people. Drinking, laughing, talking about sports, the usual stuff. I kept busy, moving between the kitchen and living room, picking up empty cups, adjusting things, and trying to keep the party running smoothly. But every time I passed by George, I felt his eyes on me, like he was waiting for something. like he knew something I didn't. And that made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. By the end of the night, Mark was pretty drunk, laughing loudly with his friends on the couch, while I was in the kitchen, washing dishes and enjoying a moment of peace. That's when I heard the kitchen door creak open. Are you seriously going to spend the rest of the night washing dishes, Claire? It was George, of course it was him. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately tried to play it cool. Someone's got to keep things in order, right? I replied, focusing on the glasses in the sink without really looking at him. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Don't you think it's time to relax a little? You seem stressed. You're always taking care of everything and everyone. But what about you, Claire? Who's taking care of you? His question caught me off guard. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. It was as if he had seen something in me that I hadn't even realized myself. And the way he spoke, calm and with that steady gaze, left me feeling exposed, unsure. I'm fine. Just taking care of my home, that's all, I said. Normal? He gave me a knowing smile. You're carrying more weight than you need to, you know? Sometimes it's good to let go, let others take care of you for a change. I stayed silent for a moment, staring at him, unsure of what to say. What was he trying to get at? Was he just being kind, or was there something more? I tried not to dwell on it, but having him there, so close, was unsettling. I'm just going to finish up here, okay? I said, turning my attention back to the dishes, trying to end the conversation. All right, Claire. Just don't forget what I said, he replied as he left the kitchen, but the feeling he left behind stayed with me. What did he mean by all that? Was I really carrying more than I should? The truth is, ever since I married Mark, life had just gone on, and I got used to it. But was it enough? The party slowly wound down, with friends leaving and the house returning to normal. Mark, completely drunk, passed out on the bed in minutes, while I stayed in the living room, still unsettled by my conversation with George. I sat on the couch, thinking about everything. Thinking about him. It wasn't right, it couldn't be. But that night, for the first time in years, I dreamed of someone other than my husband. The following days were strange. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't get George out of my head. I found myself thinking about him at the most unexpected moments, while ironing, cooking lunch, even while being with Mark. It wasn't anything explicit, but thoughts of him lingered like a shadow, constantly hovering, and I didn't know what to do about it. The following days were strange. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't get George out of my head. I found myself thinking about him at the most unexpected moments, while ironing, cooking lunch, even while being with Mark. It wasn't anything explicit, but thoughts of him lingered like a shadow, constantly hovering, and I didn't know what to do about it. After that day at the market, it felt like an invisible line had been crossed. I felt different, as if something had shifted inside me, but at the same time, I kept pretending that nothing had happened. After all, nothing had really happened, right? It was just a ride, just a weird conversation. A silly thing I was probably exaggerating in my mind. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that had been following me ever since the last time I saw George. Days went by, and I caught myself thinking about him more and more, even though I tried to focus on Mark, on our marriage, on the everyday things. The truth was, I was living on autopilot. Everything seemed dull, colorless, and I no longer knew if it was because of me or because of Mark, he was always the same, leaving early for the mechanic shop, coming home late, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to eat and sleep. It wasn't that he didn't care about me, but I felt like we were no longer connected. It was like we lived together but were just two roommates. And that feeling had only grown stronger after George showed up the way he did. One afternoon, a few days after that encounter at the market, I was home sweeping the living room, trying to distract myself with anything that wasn't George. The TV was on, showing some random program, but I wasn't paying attention. Suddenly, my phone vibrated on the couch. I picked it up, expecting it to be one of the ladies from my cosmetics group asking about an order, but when I saw the name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat, it was George, "Hey, Claire. Where are you?" The message read, I stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. A whirlwind of thoughts flooded my mind. Why was he messaging me? Was he just being friendly, or was there something more? Deep down, I knew there was something more, but I was still trying to fool myself, I waited a few seconds before finally replying, I'm at home, cleaning, his reply came almost instantly, want me to stop by and give you a hand, I laughed to myself, amazed by his audacity. George had always been playful, a bit cheeky, but this time the tone seemed different. Still, I tried to stay calm, no need, I've got it covered, I replied, but he didn't give up so easily. You sure? I've got nothing going on today. I can at least keep you company, I read that message, and my heart started beating faster. I knew he was testing me, provoking me, but part of me wanted to see how far this would go. On the other hand, I knew it wasn't right. What if Mark found out I was chatting with his uncle? Then a thought crossed my mind, he wouldn't even notice. Lately, he barely noticed me at all, no need, George, but thanks for offering, I replied, I thought that would be the end of it, but instead, he only left me more confused with his next message. Alright, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me, I knew exactly what he meant by that, but I tried to ignore it. I put my phone down and went back to what I was doing, but the damage was already done. I spent the rest of the day with George's sly smile stuck in my mind, and the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say to make me feel off balance, days continued to pass, but the atmosphere at home was strange. Mark and I barely talked, and when he got home from work, it was always the same routine. He'd eat something, watch TV, and crash on the bed. Sometimes he'd ask me how my day was, but before I could even answer, he'd already be distracted by something else. I knew work made him tired, but what about me? Where did I fit into all of this? It felt like he had gotten used to me, like I was just part of the furniture. And that bothered me more than I wanted to admit, so one of those days, I decided to go out for a walk. I needed to breathe, to clear my head. I went to the little park near our house, the one where everyone from the neighborhood gathered to play ball, chat, or just pass the time. It wasn't anything special, but it was a quiet place where I could be alone with my thoughts for a while. I sat on a bench under the shade of a tree, watching the kids play tag. Life continued on, simple and repetitive. But why did I feel stuck? I loved Mark, of course I did, but was love enough? Things between us had changed so much that I didn't even know who I was around him anymore. The Claire I used to be, the one who felt alive, passionate, seemed to have been left behind. Now I was just Mark's wife, and nothing more, as I was thinking about all this, I heard a familiar voice approaching. I can't believe I found you here alone. I looked to the side, and there he was again, George, with that same easygoing demeanor, like nothing in the world could rattle him. He sat down next to me without even asking, flashing a smile I knew all too well, are you running away from home? He teased with a half laugh, and I tried not to roll my eyes, I'm just taking a walk, George. Sometimes it's good to get out and breathe, I replied, he looked at me more seriously this time, as if trying to read my thoughts. I know what you mean. Sometimes we just need some time to think about things, I nodded in agreement but said nothing. He was right, and I think he knew that. The truth was, I was running away from my own life, the truth was, I was running away from my own life, and what are you doing here? I asked, trying to change the subject, nothing much, just wandering around, killing time. But I guess I got lucky, huh? Found you here, he said with a smirk, as if it was all part of some grand plan, I tried not to smile, but the nervousness inside me started to grow. His presence so close to me was affecting me in ways I couldn't fully understand, lucky, huh? I replied sarcastically, but I couldn't hide how flustered I was by the situation. He gave me that sideways grin again, the one that always left me feeling off balance. Claire, do you really think I don't know what's going on? Do you really think I haven't noticed? I didn't know how to respond. He leaned in a little closer, his face almost touching mine, but not quite crossing the line, I know you've been thinking, he said, his voice low, thinking about things you probably shouldn't be. But that's life, right? Sometimes we just can't control it, my breathing became heavier, and I wanted to say something, to tell him he was wrong, that nothing was going on, but I couldn't. Because he was right. I had been thinking about things I shouldn't, and he knew it. Maybe he had known all along, George, I started to say, but my voice came out in a soft whisper, you don't have to say anything. I'm not here to pressure you, Claire. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. If you ever need someone to talk to help you with anything at all, he lightly touched my shoulder, as if it was nothing, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. For a second, I thought about getting up and leaving, but something held me there. Maybe it was the way he spoke, the way he made me feel like someone was finally seeing me, listening to me, something I hadn't felt in a long time, thanks, George. But I'm fine, really, I lied, trying to convince myself more than him, he nodded, as if he understood exactly what I was trying to say, even if he didn't fully believe it, I know you are. But if one day you're not, I'll be here, okay? He stood up slowly, giving me one last smile before walking away. I stayed on the bench, watching him go, unsure of what to do next. My mind was a mess, and I didn't know what to think anymore. The next few weeks went by in a blur. The routine with Mark stayed the same, but now there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. Or rather, I could, but I didn't want to admit it. George kept lingering in my thoughts, showing up in the most unexpected moments. And more, I found myself imagining what things would be like if they were different, if I had chosen a different path, one afternoon, while I was at the supermarket, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket again. When I pulled it out, there it was, another message from George, want to grab a coffee this afternoon, I stared at the screen for a while, not knowing what to say. Part of me wanted to say no, to put an end to all this once and for all. But another part of me, a stronger part, wanted to say yes. I wanted to see how far this could go, I took a deep breath, and before I could change my mind, I typed out my reply. Sure. Where? He replied quickly, as if he had been waiting for me to say yes. At that little cafe around the corner from your house. In half an hour, okay, I typed back, without thinking too much, I hurried through the rest of my shopping, my heart pounding. When I got home, I dropped the grocery bags in the kitchen and went straight to the bedroom to check myself in the mirror. It wasn't that I wanted to impress him, but, well, I wanted to at least look presentable. I ran a brush through my hair, put on a little lipstick, and left the house before I could talk myself out of it, when I got to the cafe, I saw George sitting at a table near the window, a coffee already in front of him. He saw me as I walked in and smiled, waving me over to join him, right on time, he teased, giving me that once-over look he always did. Yeah, I hate making people wait, I replied with a smile, sitting down across from him. The atmosphere between us was strange but comfortable at the same time, as if we both knew there was something between us but neither of us wanted to be the first to bring it up. We made small talk for a while, talking about the neighborhood, the usual day-to-day things. But then, out of nowhere, he stopped and looked me in the eye again, Claire, you don't have to feel trapped, you know. You don't have to live a life that doesn't make you happy. His words caught me off guard, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Because that was it, wasn't it? Deep down, I was trapped in a life I wasn't sure made me happy anymore. And George knew that better than anyone, I stayed quiet, stirring my coffee, not daring to meet his gaze, I stayed quiet, stirring my coffee, not daring to meet his gaze. A few days after the party, I was leaving the house to go to the market when I ran into him again. This time, he was outside, leaning against his motorcycle as if he were waiting for someone. When he saw me, he gave that smile, the one that was starting to mess with my head, Hey Claire, everything okay? Hey George. What are you up to? I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling my face heat up, not much, just hanging around, thought I'd take a ride. Need a lift to the market? I should have said no. I should have thanked him and walked like I always did. But for some reason, my legs betrayed me, and before I knew it, I was climbing onto the back of his bike. And it was there, holding tightly to his waist as he sped through the streets, that I felt like everything was about to change, though I still didn't know just how much, we got to the market quickly, and I got off the bike, trying to act normal. He took off his helmet and looked at me with that teasing smile, faster than walking, I laughed nervously. Yeah, definitely faster. Thanks for the ride, you know where to find me if you need anything else, Claire. I'm always around, he said, giving me that signature smirk before driving off, leaving me standing at the entrance of the market with my heart racing and my mind full of thoughts I didn't want to have, after that coffee with George, my mind was more confused than ever. I knew I shouldn't, I knew I was walking into something complicated, but it felt like something bigger was pulling me in. It wasn't just about George, it was about the life I was living, the feeling that I was invisible in my own marriage. I wasn't the Claire I used to be, and if I was honest with myself, I didn't know when I had stopped being her, that day, when I got home, Mark still hadn't arrived from work, and I took advantage of the silence to try to think things through. But the problem was, the more I thought about it, the more I found myself sinking into this whirlwind of confusing feelings. I wanted to be a good wife, I wanted to do things right, but what about me? Who was taking care of me? The truth was, George stirred something in me that I couldn't ignore anymore, and that was scary. Because I knew it wasn't just a silly crush, there was something more there, something I was avoiding facing head-on, when Mark got home, as usual, he went straight to the shower and then flopped onto the couch, turning the TV up loudly and talking about random stuff. That was our routine. He talked, I listened, but deep down, we barely communicated. I even tried to start a different conversation, asking him about his day, but his answers were always short, mechanical, and soon the conversation would die out. Everything okay, honey? I asked, trying to open a dialogue. You seem quiet, he shrugged, not even looking away from the TV. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, the usual, and there it was again, the conversation didn't go anywhere, and I went back to feeling alone, even with him right next to me, a few days later, I got another message from George. This time, the invitation wasn't for an innocent coffee. He suggested we meet somewhere more discreet, in a neighboring town, far from the neighborhood. The excuse was to get some fresh air, to break away from the routine, but we both knew what that really meant. We knew it was a big step, one too big to take lightly, I spent hours staring at that message, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend I had never seen it, to carry on with my life as if nothing had happened. But the other part, that part that had been dormant inside me for so long, wanted to see where this would go, in the end, I gave in, maybe out of weakness, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe because I had this need to feel alive again. I don't know. But what I do know is that on that Friday morning, I left the house telling Mark I had some errands to run downtown. Without thinking much, I got on a bus headed for the town where George had suggested we meet, he was already there, waiting for me at a small, discreet cafe on a quiet corner. When I arrived, he was sitting at a table with that smile that always knocked me off my feet, I thought you weren't going to come, he said as I sat down across from him, I thought you wouldn't be here either, I replied, laughing awkwardly, feeling my nerves take over, we sat there making small talk, trying to act as if what was happening was normal, as if we weren't about to cross a line. But the tension between us was palpable. Every word he said, every time our eyes met, the air between us felt heavier, you know that sooner or later we were going to end up here, right? He said out of nowhere, looking at me in a way that made my heart race. George, we're playing with fire, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, he laughed, that smug laugh he always gave when he thought I was being too serious. Claire, since when did you start worrying about fire? Life is about this. We've got to live, or do you want to keep dragging yourself through this life next to a guy who doesn't even notice you anymore? His words hit me hard because he was right. I couldn't deny it any longer. Mark had stopped seeing me a long time ago. And in a way, I had stopped seeing myself as a woman. Our life had turned into an endless loop, with no surprises, no spark. I didn't want to admit it, but George was the only person who had made me feel alive again in a long time. He knew that, and he used it to his advantage, I sat there, looking at him, not knowing what to say. Part of me wanted to run away, to go back home and pretend that all of this was just a mistake. But the other part, the impulsive part, wanted to stay, wanted to see where this story would lead, in the end, it was that second part of me, that one, alright, George, but, what do you suggest? I asked, my voice betraying my decision, he smiled, knowing he had me. Let's take a walk. There's a quiet spot nearby where we can talk more privately, I nodded, not saying anything else. We left the cafe and walked to a small, secluded park, almost empty. We sat on a bench in silence for a while, watching the few people passing by. I knew I was making a mistake, I knew I was walking down a path I couldn't return from, but in that moment, I also knew I couldn't go back, he put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that seemed innocent enough, but I felt the weight of it throughout my entire body, I've always thought there was something different about you, Claire. From the first time I saw you with Mark, I knew there was something about you, something he never appreciated, I stayed quiet, feeling his words sink in like a sweet poison. It felt good to hear those things, even if it was wrong. It felt good to feel like someone was paying attention to me again, like someone saw value in me, you deserve more, Claire. Much more, and what's this more that you think I deserve, George? I asked, my voice low, he moved closer, his eyes locked on mine, and spoke softly, whatever you want. The life you want to live. All you have to do is stop being afraid, I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't need any of that. But deep down, I knew he was right. I had been living in fear for a long time, fear of change, fear of taking risks, fear of leaving my comfort zone, no matter how uncomfortable it had become, his hand slid down to my arm, and I didn't pull away. It was as if, in that moment, the world had stopped. There was only me and him, sitting on that park bench, as if the rest of the universe was just a meaningless detail. This is all crazy, right? I said, trying to hold my ground, so what? Life is about doing crazy things, Claire. If you don't take risks, you'll never know what could have been, I didn't have the strength to argue anymore. The truth was, I had already given in, even if I didn't want to admit it. As much as I tried to convince myself that this was just a phase, just a mistake, the feeling of being alive again was too strong for me to ignore. We stayed there a while longer, not saying much, just feeling the weight of what had happened. I knew that from now on, things would be different. I knew that from that moment on, what had once been just a hidden temptation had become something real, something I would have to deal with, when we finally said goodbye, he looked at me in a way I wouldn't forget anytime soon, we'll see each other again, Claire. This isn't over, I didn't respond, just nodded my head and walked back home, trying to process everything. When I got there, Mark was already lying on the couch, watching TV as usual. As always, he barely lifted his eyes to look at me, did you get everything done? He asked, not taking his eyes off the screen, yeah, I did, I replied. And it was true. I had resolved everything. Not in the way he imagined, but I had resolved it, after that day, George started showing up more often. Sometimes he'd message me, suggesting we meet again, and each time, I gave in. It was as if I no longer had control over what was happening. With every encounter, we grew closer, and the line we had crossed felt further and further behind, the worst part was, Mark still didn't notice anything. To him, everything was the same. I was still the wife he knew, the one who made lunch, cleaned the house, always there. But inside, I was someone else. I knew it, and more, I found myself wondering how long it would last before everything came crashing down, George, on the other hand, seemed more confident with each passing day. He knew the power he had over me, knew that I had reached a point of no return. And he used that to his advantage, in a way that left me dizzy, lost, you don't have to keep living this life, Claire. If you're not happy, leave it all behind and come with me, he'd say in our conversations. But I wasn't ready to take that step. I was afraid, of course, afraid of leaving everything behind and ending up alone. Afraid of losing the little I still had, even though I knew I had lost most of myself long ago, days went by, and the weight of my choices began to suffocate me. I knew that sooner or later, Mark would find out. I knew that when he did, our life would collapse. But at the same time, I couldn't stop what was happening with George. It was like a drug, a poison that consumed me, but that I couldn't quit, and that's how I realized that sometimes we let ourselves be led into something we know will go wrong, just because, deep down, what we really want is to feel alive again, even if it's just for a moment. Before you leave, remember to subscribe. I still had, even though I knew I had lost most of myself long ago, days went by, and the weight of my choices began to suffocate me. I knew that sooner or later, Mark would find out. I knew that when he did, our life would collapse. But at the same time, I couldn't stop what was happening with George. It was like a drug, a poison that consumed me, but that I couldn't quit, and that's how I realized that sometimes we let ourselves be led into something we know will go wrong, just because, deep down, what we really want is to feel alive again, even if it's just for a moment. Before you leave, remember to subscribe.